Okay, well, welcome and thank you all for joining us for our late 2023 Advocacy Days, but really this is all leading up to the 2024 legislative session where we're going to be advocating for some really key environmental bills. But the wonderful thing about what you're going to be learning tonight is that these advocacy skills can be applied for the environment or for any cause that you are passionate about. So I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, and I'd also like to invite folks to learn which native land that you are joining from. So I am going to drop a link in the chat. If you have never explored this map before, it's really cool. You can put in your address and it shows you which historic native lands that you are living and occupying. So I am on historic Coast Salish land, and we want to honor that we live and work on the traditional and ancestral lands of the nations whose current lands we call Washington. And we encourage you to explore and learn a little bit about those native tribes, many of whom are still living and working and taking care of being stewards of our land. And you can drop your native land that you're joining us from in the chat, as well as your name, your pronouns, if you care to share, and the city that you're joining from. So without further ado, we've got a packed agenda tonight. We're going to be starting with an overview of the 3 environmental priorities that the Environmental Priorities Coalition is going to be advocating for this year: holding oil companies accountable, 100% clean school buses, and we're bringing back the RAP Act. 3rd time is the charm. So with your help, we can get that over the finish line this year. Then we'll do a legislative lay of the land, talk through how to meet with your legislators and go through a lobby training, and then next steps for how to be prepared for those legislator meetings that are going to happen in December this year. We heard from you all and from legislators that having these conversations in December before session starts is a really impactful way for them to take action. And then we'll follow up with discussion and Q&A. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Leah from Climate Solutions to talk about our first 2 priorities.
Hey everybody, just a quick sound check, make sure everybody can hear me. Okay, I saw some nods. My headphones aren't working, so I'm using a different setup. Technology. But yeah, anyway, really nice to see you all. Just to quickly introduce myself, like Kat said, my name is Leah. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm with Climate Solutions. And I'm the Senior Washington Policy Manager at Climate Solutions. I do a lot of transportation-related work. So the first priority that we're going to talk about is holding oil companies accountable. So I think probably there's no love lost for oil companies in this group, but to sort of hit the point here, oil companies made over $200 billion in profits last year alone, a massive amount of money. But what they're doing right now is they're turning around and trying to blame the high prices at the pump on our climate policies, rather than what is the main driving factor here, which is their really, really high profits. And they're really spending a lot of money, frankly, on ads attacking the Climate Commitment Act and other climate policies like the Clean Fuel Standard that we really championed as an environmental community a few years ago and got passed. And so it's really important for us that we protect these policies, but also hold oil companies accountable and be more transparent about how they set their prices, what actually goes into the price at the pump, costs and profits up and down the value chain, so we can tell where they are making a massive amount of profit, and then also hold them accountable if we find that there's price gouging or greenwashing or other sort of nefarious practices in their pricing at the pump and other activities. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of accountability on these companies historically on a lot of different fronts, as I'm sure you all know. But this one is really poignant right now today. The price at the pump, again, they're trying to blame climate policies and deflect blame when they're turning around and making these just massive amounts of profit. So we think it's really important that the legislature pass something this legislative session, and we're really excited that there is going to be governor request legislation around this. I want to share with folks that they are still working on the final details of this, so I won't be able to answer very specific questions, but I also want folks to know that that transparency piece and the state getting more information, which is really that critical first step to determining what specifically they're doing, is going to be a part of it. That second piece around how exactly they're going to enforce accountability for, is it greenwashing? Is it something under the Consumer Protection Act? They're still working on that, but we really hope and have conveyed this message, and we're definitely being heard. I think that we need to get more transparency around the price at the pump and have that information and then be able to hold oil companies accountable to their words. So I will pause there, but really excited about this priority and yeah, sticking it back to them. Do you want me to take questions right now, Kat, on this priority, or should we zoom to the next one too?
Maybe we can cover both and then you can take questions all at once.
Okay, sounds good. Well, let's go to the next slide then. So the second priority of the Environmental Priorities Coalition that I'll talk about today is 100% clean school buses. So the last one was more focused on here's what's wrong, here's one on here's what's right. And what is right, I think, is getting kids to school in a way that is good for the climate, good for kids' health, and good for bus drivers. It's quieter, it's great, it's a lot of things, right? So a couple important facts for folks to know. So school buses are actually our country's and Washington's as well largest transit network if you look at all the school buses together, right? There's a lot of them. So there's over 10,000 school buses in Washington right now, and most of them are diesel. And that, you know, it's really important to provide school buses and get kids rides to school, but diesel is so bad for our health. It is a known carcinogen, and kids' lungs are particularly vulnerable because they're still growing, right? And even worse, there are studies that show that diesel inside the school bus can be more than 4 times worse than outside. So I'm sure everybody knows what it's like standing next to something that's burning diesel. That's not nice, but the pollution is worse inside the bus. And so this is not only a climate priority in my view, but it's also a health priority. And so we think that it's high time that Washington commit to transitioning its school bus fleet to be zero emission. Some other states have already done this, and we certainly should not be left behind. So there's a bill that has already been introduced by Representative Sen. It's going to be moving forward this session with some adjustments, and we're really hopeful, and we think this will hopefully happen. There's a lot of enthusiasm in the legislature that will set a date by which all new school bus purchases must be zero emission, and then another date by which all school buses on the road must be zero emission. We're hoping for 2027 and 2035 to be those dates. That would align with what New York State has, and there's no reason we should be behind New York, especially because this gets to the second part. We have funding to do this. Thanks to the Climate Commitment Act, we have funds to reinvest money that's coming in from big polluters and put it toward the good stuff. And I think this is a great example. And so it's also really important that we don't burden schools, right? Unfortunately, right now, electric buses do cost more upfront than diesel buses. Of course, they save a lot in terms of the fuel cost of electricity is much, much lower than diesel, and the maintenance is lower, but you still have to account for that upfront cost. And so we're fully committed to helping schools make this transition and put significant funding toward this. So this priority is both that bill to have a transition in law by which we switch over to clean school buses and fund it, something in the budget. So those two priorities together. I will pause there, and those are the two I have. So I'll sit back and see if we have questions.
Great. Thank you, Leah. I do want to note, Leah, thank you so much for joining us, that Leah does have to leave us a little bit early, so we will have time for questions later, and several of us can try to do our best to address any questions about these priorities, but Leah is one of the experts on this, and so please take your opportunity if you have any questions to ask.
Cool. And I see folks are raising their hands, which is great. So the first hand I saw was Pam.
Hey, yeah, my question is about other states that have passed this policy. I know you mentioned New York, but I was curious when they passed that and then if there were other states.
Yes. Did you say when New York passed it?
And then
Okay.
if there are the other states, yeah.
Yep. So New York passed it in 2022, I believe. And yes, there are other states. There are on top of New York, Connecticut, Maryland, Maine, and California all have laws that have a specific timeline for that transition. So it's those ones, and I can put the list in the chat if that is helpful. And then other states have not passed a timeline for transitioning, but have passed significant funding. So for example, Colorado has passed significant funding in a goal that all school buses will be zero emission by 2035, but it's not a hard requirement. So there's a lot of states that have different policies, but those 5 states that I mentioned are the ones that have an actual timeline in statute, and I'll drop that in the chat. Grace, that's the next question that I see.
Yeah, I know we have 2 contractors that run the school bus system in Seattle. Like, does the state own all of the school buses? Like, how are they able to, like, what does that look like? And does this apply to independent schools as well?
Yeah, great question. So there's sort of a couple of pieces to this. So we have school bus contract companies, like you mentioned, operating in Washington state. And for folks who don't know, those are basically companies that provide school bus services to school districts. So the school district does not own or operate the school bus. A private company that they have contracted with does. Those private companies would be included under this transition. I think that's really important, especially since, as you mentioned, there's a couple of our very large school districts in Washington do contract services. So the way the vast majority of school buses work here in Washington state are, you have the contracted buses, and then most districts own their own buses, and those are funded through the Office of the Superintendent, which is OSPI. That's the abbreviation of the agency. And OSPI reimburses schools for the school buses that they purchase. OSPI reimburses schools that contract based on a formula for students, how they're traveling and stuff like that. So our vision for this is that, yes, it would cover all school buses operating in the state in one way or another. And we are hoping to make it easy for those school districts that own and operate their own, so they don't have to jump through a lot of hoops and apply to get a grant for every single school bus. Instead, we can use the existing process by which they are reimbursed for their school bus purchases, and just have a kicker in there for the higher cost of the electric school bus. So I hope that covered everything that you asked. Let's see, Ellie.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just verifying, based on what you just said, that this is not going to be the same as those grants that are now out there for clean school buses that depend on the population that the buses are serving. So I'm thinking of like Tacoma, where I'm at. We're served by First Student, private company, but not all of Tacoma is considered disadvantaged. So would it apply to all the school buses, or just the school buses going certain routes? What's the vision?
The vision is all school buses. We need to transition all school buses. That said, we do have legislators that are interested, and I think this is worth exploring to make sure that schools that have an even harder time, that are in more polluted areas, maybe can be first in line if there's funding limitations. I actually hope there's not. I hope the funding ask that we're making is based on applications to the federal government that were not funded. So there was, just for folks to know, the federal government has a program that's been very popular, 5 school buses were funded in the last federal funding round in Washington. 181 buses were on the list. So there's like really large demand, but we know exactly what it is. So all that to say is, yes, this vision is that it would apply to everybody, but if we do have constraints or there are lower income schools or schools in overburdened communities that need extra help, that this would take that into account as well. So it's a both thing. And yes, Scott, I see there's EPA, just for folks to know, there's federal funding that what I just mentioned from the EPA. Washington State has done a couple of rounds of funding for clean school buses through 2 different grant programs, the Clean Diesel Program and the Volkswagen Settlement Program, which have been great. Those 2 programs are responsible for almost all zero emission school buses that we have on the road today in Washington. But given the funding sources, they're a little bit more complicated. There are more strings attached. And what we want to do is, especially with an ambitious but necessary timeline, make it super easy for schools. So it's, again, reimbursing them through the process that they already go through. Yeah. Kat.
One that didn't make it until last time.
It's not really Kat. It's
Oh.
someone who's logged in with my name, but who, the cat who has their hand raised. Are you able to come off mute?
Oh, I apologize. I wonder if that's me.
It is. We can rename you. What's your name?
Okay. My name's Joel.
Great.
I was wondering if you know what the number is, what the cost would be to replace all the school buses in the state by the 2035 timeline. Is there a total cost that you've calculated?
Yeah, so that actually is a pretty tricky formula because it depends on the growth rate over time. It depends on your counterfactual, and it depends on how prices go over time. And that's a little bit difficult to predict. I will say too that the World Resources Institute is predicting upfront price parity between a diesel school bus and an electric school bus by 2033, and total cost of ownership parity. So that means the lifetime cost of not just buying, but also operating the bus will be on par by 2029 and maybe a little bit earlier. So I don't want to calculate that all the way out till 2035 or even before, given that we're going to hit price parity. I will say that if you look at like up until that timeline, you're probably going to be looking at a significant sum. Like, again, I can throw a number out there and I don't want to be quoted because it's based on so many different variables. But I will say, if you look at that ramp up, we're looking at, and you also have to account for infrastructure costs, right? But if you look at that ramp up, I think it's pretty fair to say, and this is our budget ask, to look at about $60 million for this next year. And then it will ramp up slightly year after year after that, up until we hit total cost of ownership parity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the ask is for 60 million for the for this budget, but then an additional amount for the next biennium.
Correct.
Okay.
And
Just
one other thing
60
to
million in the
note
supplemental.
is,
I mean,
sorry.
60 million in the supplemental budget. I mean,
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. 60.5 technically is the ask, based on calculations, and that is inclusive of infrastructure. I will also just note for folks that, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second, but the way schools also purchase their school buses, like I said, they are reimbursed through OSPI. They purchase the school bus, OSPI reimburses them over time, and they use that pot of fund to sort of purchase their next vehicle usually. And so actually it's sort of this upfront spurt of funds. And once that sort of gets going in the cycle, schools will, in theory, have that cash reserve to start purchasing more expensive buses later down the line as they're reimbursed. So there's also that factor as well. Yeah.
I had one more real quick question about the 200 billion number for oil company profits.
Yes.
It sounds like a lot, but I think people I would be talking to would be asking me for context. Do we know what that number is as like a percentage of revenue, or how it's changed over time? Or is there more information that I can give to people to say, no, actually, the price at the pump is because their profits are growing.
Yep. The quick answer to that, and if you Google like oil company profits 2022, there's a lot of great resources there, but that's the Western oil majors, and those were record profits. So they made more in 2022 than they ever did. And also I'll note gas prices were actually higher last summer in Washington than they peaked at this summer in Washington. So those high prices corresponded with their high profits.
Okay, good.
I'm going to go quickly through the next questions because we only have a couple minutes. So if folks can be very quick, Rosemary. Up, you're muted.
Yeah, mine was similar to Joel's last point about the oil company profits. And I was thinking, well, profits, that could just mean they sold more oil. I think it would be more relevant to kind of show that their profit per unit sold was bigger. If it was, I mean, I just, when I saw it, it just seemed so conclusory. I was like, oh, that could, be viewed as not very credible. And I don't know. I like Joel, I kind of wondered what that really meant, and I think it's important to, if you go out in public and make assertions like that, to be quite sure that they're fully supported.
Yep, I assure you, we have a lot of data on that. I'm not going to go into it right now, but like I said, if you look up oil company profits 2022, it was big news. Actually, you'll find a lot of news about this, and yeah, but we do have a lot of information on that. Alpana, or sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly.
Yeah, Alpana.
Alpana, thank you.
My question was, the school buses uses diesel at this moment, and that is 4 times worse than outside those electric buses. But when we try to employ electric buses, we have to replace them, right? There's a lot of money, and those buses will not work at that time. And who will be responsible for this budget first? Is it the federal government or the superintendent's office? And the 60 million supplement budget, you said we have the money in the very beginning. So how would you calculate that? Is it coming from the federal government, or you are asking it from the superintendent's office? Who is responsible for this money, and how come this money will be available there?
We have a lot of money for spending on climate projects at the state level, thanks to the Climate Commitment Act. So in Washington, we have big polluters have to pay for their pollution now, and it's using that money. Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
All right, one quick question from Susan.
Yes, I just wondered if the superintendent of public instruction has endorsed this proposal.
Not yet. There's been a lot of discussions about it at the state level, but no endorsement as of yet. I would hope so, and we're doing a lot of work. And I would love for those of you who are involved in different sort of school groups to sort of see how much support you can get. But there you go. But okay, I'll end it now. My time is up, but I did want to say, like Kat said, they're happy to track it down. Joelle on the Climate Solutions team will be your point. So if you have any further questions, shoot Joelle an email or however you usually communicate with her, and she will try to get back to you if things come up on the oil company side or the school buses side. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Leah. We really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you, Leah.
Right, we'll pass it on to Pam next to talk to you about the WRAP Act.
Great, thanks everyone. Hi, my name is Pam Clough. I am an advocate with Environment Washington, and I'm excited to share more context about the Washington Recycling and Packaging Act, or the WRAP Act. I think a lot of us have seen firsthand how the plastic pollution issue has played out, whether it's from seeing litter in your communities or, just the proliferation of plastic packaging on our shelves. I wanted to share a little more context about how that's played into the problems that we have with our waste management system in Washington. More than 50% of all consumer packaging and paper products in Washington are landfilled or incinerated. So that's not only wasteful from a climate perspective, from a resource perspective, but also it wastes $104 million of valuable materials. Additionally, the proliferation of plastic and single-use packaging and other hard to recycle materials that we see on shelves have contributed to increased costs of our recycling system, among some other factors. And for some Washingtonians, recycling bills have increased by 36% in the last 7 years. And those increased costs have led to reduced service for many Washingtonians. There are some cities in Washington that they've actually stopped curbside recycling altogether. Some cities have induced service charges or just reduced what types of materials are collected. Additionally, recycling is unequal across the state. Especially rural communities have a lot less access to good recycling services. Actually, residents in 11 counties have no access to curbside recycling services at all. Next slide. So the goal of the WRAP Act, and what the WRAP Act would actually do, is establish a producer responsibility program in our state for paper and packaging products. This would make companies and manufacturers financially responsible for what happens to their products at their end of life. So, these are the companies and manufacturers that are actually making decisions about packaging in the first place. And so these types of systems can put in place incentives for companies to use more sustainable packaging design. Next slide. This is not a new idea. Actually, producer responsibility programs for funding recycling programs have been in place since the 90s. Germany was the first country in the world to establish such a program in 1991. And we've seen really good results. Countries have recycling rates 85–90%. Just our neighbors to the north in British Columbia have recycling rates at 85%, and compare that to Washington's, which is less than 50%. Some of these programs also utilize a bottle bill, which can also help improve recycling outcomes. And so the US is trying to catch up, and there are 4 states that already passed extended producer responsibility programs to fund their recycling system. So those are in green on the map here. And we want Washington to be the 5th. The global map, it's all the blue countries those are the places where we already have producer responsibility programs in place. So next slide. There are a lot of benefits to that. If we pass the WRAP Act, these would be the benefits for establishing producer responsibility. So first, we'd have increased accountability for producers and manufacturers for their product design. Access will increase. So any resident that currently receives garbage curbside service would also receive curbside recycling service. Ease of recycling would improve, and we'd have more transparency in end markets for recycled materials, meaning we can have more confidence that what we put in the blue bin is actually going to be remade into a new product. Last 2 points I'll touch on. The WRAP Act would establish one list across the whole state of what you can and can't put in the blue bin. So that would decrease confusion about what is recyclable instead of it being different from one city to the next. And it would transfer the cost of recycling onto companies. So that would decrease the burdens for, cost burden that we have as residents for paying for the end of life costs of all this waste. So yeah, I think that's my time. So I think we definitely have some time for questions. But maybe you guys are all experts because, you've advocated for it last year and maybe even the year before. So Okay, we see one question. Yeah, Alpana.
My only question is, since last year I did a lot to push for this bill. Where did it, what do you know, what was the result, why they did not pass this bill? Do you know that? What was the reason to put there?
Yeah, there has been a lot of pushback from the waste industry, the haulers. I think there's they've had some concerns around, you know, how would this policy impact them. I think there was also some concerns around the bottle bill portion of the WRAP Act. This year, that is being separated into a separate policy than the producer responsibility bill, instead of all wrapped into one. We support both, but we definitely want to see producer responsibility passed first, just for a number of different dynamics, or at the same time as the bottle bill. Our bill sponsor, Rep Berry, has been having really productive conversations with the waste industry around, you know, specific policy language that, you know, could help address their concerns. Yeah, I think they're overall, they have concerns that, you know, they don't want they don't want companies to, you know, I guess have too much control over a recycling system. Though there's a lot of safeguards in place, you know, through ecology to ensure that there's a lot of accountability. There's a lot of, like, there's annual reports on, you know, recycling rates to be met, and the cost structures, and so there's a lot of great safeguards in place to ensure really good outcomes and that all players are treated fairly.
So the language has changed this year, correct?
There will be some changes, but in large part the bones are the same, besides the fact that the bottle bill will just be separated out into a separate policy that will be sponsored by Monica Stonier out of Vancouver.
Thank you.
Rosemary.
Unmuted. I was wondering if you knew whether, if this bill is passed and implemented, will it affect greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so recycling has, yes. So there is the slide that I use in other longer presentations that shows how better recycling can affect greenhouse gas emissions. And the long and short of it is, by utilizing recycled materials, it reduces our need to use virgin materials. So whether that's, you know, cutting down trees or mining aluminum, or, you know, it's a lot cheaper, like just using aluminum cans as an example. It is very resource intensive and emissions intensive to mine, you know, raw aluminum. It needs to be smelted at a much higher temperature than, you know, existing purified aluminum cans. And so, you know, that's just one example of one material, how using recycled materials is a lot less resource intensive. It uses less energy and therefore has less of a climate impact. So that's just one aspect of how having more access, better access to good recycled materials can make a really big difference from a climate perspective. But I think another thing I want to address in that, layered into that question, is, you know, plastics are a climate issue. Plastics are derived from fossil fuel. And so we really want to see policies that will help incentivize less plastic use in the first place. And so that the cost structure of how this producer responsibility system would be funded using a tiered fee system, so that, you know, there's a higher cost for single-use plastic that's not really recyclable, with lower costs for, you know, companies choosing to use reusable materials. It's that type of dynamic that we want to see help contribute to reducing the amount of single-use materials, and especially single-use plastic, in the first place. We see that as a really important opportunity for how we can also reduce the climate impact. Sabrina.
Hi, I have a question about whether there might be any protections against these manufacturers trying to pass that cost on to their customers. I could see this really affecting lower income communities adversely. Having worked in manufacturing myself, I know that the first thing they're going to do is work that into the price of their product.
Yeah, that's a great question, something I get a lot. So when Oregon was the first state that passed this type of program, and this is something they studied. They actually looked at the same basket of goods in a bunch of different stores in Oregon and then in British Columbia, where they've had a producer responsibility system in place for a while. And they found no correlation of increased costs just because, you know, that same basket of goods was in an EPR jurisdiction. And it's important to note, remember that map where there's all the countries that already have producer responsibility? Yeah, great. The companies are already doing this. Chances are we are already paying for this. And so just our state is, it's already baked in because of the prevalence around the world globally of how, you know, companies are adapting to producer responsibility programs in place. The last thing I'll note is that we've had a lot of discussions with Ameripen, which is a corporate association that represents packaging. You know, they're not any one type, they're not paper, they just like represent packaging industries across the board. And their take on this question was there's a lot of other economic factors that have a much higher influence on price rather than Washington state passing a producer responsibility system or law. So with all of those things in mind, you know, that Oregon basket of goods studies, the other economic costs, that's something that we don't see as, we don't anticipate it being a very large problem.
Okay. The only other sticking point I can think of is the PR around it, like making sure that consumers know that it's not affecting them significantly and they won't be, you know, against the legislation because of that.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to keep in mind too is that we are paying for recycling now. And so heck, even if there was a small price increase, we won't be paying for recycling. So true. Or for any consumer that does pay for recycling systems. So there will be, you know, not only do we anticipate there not being, you know, that problem of pricing increases for consumers for all those reasons I stated, but yeah, recycling costs will be taken off of our backs and placed on companies.
Thanks.
Yeah. Ellie.
So I have a question on who does this affect? Because we can't put laws in place on producers that are out of state, right? So this is just in state?
This affects any company that sells products in Washington.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh. Thank you.
Yeah. Emery.
Hi, so I'm participating with my mom and she had a question.
Okay.
So it's around what people are asking about with the economic impact to businesses. But where I see opposition, especially in Washington, is from small and medium-sized businesses. What is the cost impact to them, the producers within our state, and just small and medium-sized businesses in general? What is that kind of economic impact to them? I'm not opposed to it. I just want to know how to address that issue.
There is, and I wish I remember the specific number here, but I can look it up really quickly. There is a de minimis standard in the policy. So for companies that, you know, sell less than a certain dollar amount of, you know, revenue annually, they will not be considered companies that need to be part of this program. So I can find what that after the Q&A, I can like put that answer, that detailed answer in the chat.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, the design of that de minimis standard is to protect small, medium-sized businesses. And then there's a cat raising their hand. Joel, is that you?
I think I got the wrong number too. Well, wrong name too. So my name is actually Kai instead of Cat.
Hi.
Okay, but anyway, I was curious if Washington is going to be number 5. These systems would most likely evolve. So is there any plan to coordinate with the other states so it's aligned, so it's efficient?
Yeah, there's we're definitely looking at Oregon and California's policies. And so when I was talking about, you know, the bones of the producer responsibility program will be largely the same as it was last year. There are some policy details that we are like, okay, well, let's just grab that from the California bill, or, you know, the Oregon already has a list of covered products. And so, you know, our proposed list of products will be the same. So we're definitely looking to other states that have already passed this legislation and using that as a way that, you know, it's like companies are already going to need to apply or comply with those programs in other states. And so that's something that definitely legislators and companies really appreciate, is when there's, you know, more uniformity across state lines. Thank you, guys. If that's it, my email will be on a slide later on in the presentation. So if any questions come up, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much, Pam. We really appreciate your enthusiasm. Like I said, I feel like it's a good year. Third time's a charm. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Adam to talk us through a lay of the land of the legislature.
Thanks, Kat. And bear with me, I might cough a few times. I'm feeling the cold weather that we're all getting and starting to cough a bit. So if I do, just bear with me here. So just want to go over some of the basics of what we're expecting this legislative session, and then I'm going to pass it over to Tara to talk a little bit about, more specifically, about what to expect from these meetings that we're setting up December 4th through 8th. So the 2024 session, which is amazingly starting very soon, is a short legislative session. Just a little bit of background on the legislature. The Washington State Legislature is divided into 49 independent legislative districts. Each district has 2 representatives and 1 senator. And basically, we're trying to set up meetings with both the representatives and the senators. That doesn't mean we'll be able to set up meetings for every single person who signed up, but we as an organizing team are setting up meetings with as many of them as possible. So legislative sessions operate on a biennium. Last year's session, or actually this year's session, the one that happened in early 2023, was a long session. That means that there's a much longer period of time in which legislators have to consider policies and budget items that are put forward in front of them. And the second part of a biennium is a short session. It's around 60 days, and it's often called a supplemental session. It's really, the legislative session structure was designed a long time ago, and really the purpose of the short sessions is to wrap up unfinished business in the long session. So if there's policies that didn't pass, like the WRAP Act, or if there's budget items that need to be addressed and are kind of new realizations the legislature has figured out, then the supplemental session, which is what we're heading into, is an opportunity to address those issues. So this is one of those supplemental short sessions. So it's going to be a sprint, and that's one of the reasons we want to get the environmental community's top priorities, the top 3 priorities of the environmental community in front of legislators now, so that when we're sending emails and calling them during the legislative session, during that sprint of a session, they remember meeting with us, and they are able to attach policies and legislation to faces and hearts and the people that have actually met with them. So it's going to be roughly January 8th is the start date through roughly March 8th. Depending on when it actually finishes. Hopefully it'll finish on time. And as I said, short sessions are when state budgets are revised and finalized, and then policy business is sort of carried over from the previous session. So this may be familiar to many of you, but we have a mix of people's familiarity with how the legislature works. So I just want to kind of go over a little bit of where bills come from. So state and local agencies can request legislation. Local or state agencies especially will often request legislation to address needs that they're seeing. You know, in the case of Audubon specifically, you know, like the Department of Fish and Wildlife may recognize an issue that's emerging that they want to request legislation in support of, or request budget support from the legislature. The governor's office often will request legislation, and Leah mentioned earlier that the oil company accountability bill is going to be governor and attorney general actually request legislation. Lawmakers can come up with ideas for bills, but often lawmakers are working with advocacy groups like Audubon Washington, like 350 Washington, like Environment Washington and Washington Conservation Action to develop bills. And activists are often the ones who are talking to lawmakers about what kind of problems exist in their community and what kind of action should be taken to remediate those issues. So that's where bills come from. And then the process is complicated, but also in a certain way fairly simple. So one of those groups has an idea. They put in a drafting request, and legislators work with legislative committees to draft those bills. The bills then go into, there's 2 chambers of the legislature. There's a House and a Senate. And so bills will start in whichever chamber the bill originates from. So if a bill, if for instance, Representative Fitzgibbon of the 34th District has a bill, it's going to start in the House. It's going to start in a committee that is relevant to the topic that the policy speaks to. And then if there's a impact to the state budget, it's going to move into a fiscal committee, a committee that has to do with the money necessary to implement the bill. And then from there, it passes into the floor, which is, you know, what we usually think of when we picture a legislature. There'll be floor debate, and ultimately it is adopted by the first chamber. And then it goes over to the second chamber, and in that chamber then will go through the same process. If there's any changes to the bill through that second chamber process, it has to go back to the first chamber for concurrence before it goes to the governor, and the governor has a choice of vetoing the bill or passing the bill, and then ultimately the bill becomes law. So as I said, it's a complex process, but if you kind of follow it step by step, it does make a certain amount of sense. We figure out the policy, we figure out how much it costs, we pass it over to the other chamber, they go through that same process, and then they find agreement, give it to the executive branch makes the final call. So this is actually just sort of another way of kind of displaying that information. But the reason that this slide is here is because this is, you know, once we get to the legislative session, especially in a short session, all these things happen very quickly. So goes policy committee, fiscal committee, rules committee, which is really, it's just a way to get it to the floor. And then it goes to the floor, and all of these happen in very quick succession. And that's one of the reasons that we, as I noted earlier, we're doing advocacy days. And as Audubon, we've done advocacy days for a few years before the session, because this happens so quickly that we want to make sure that we're able to touch base with legislators before the session begins, and they are completely inundated with committee meetings. So yeah, I just want to make a couple notes about this legislative session. So Audubon's been doing these advocacy days for a few years, these pre-session advocacy days, and one of the reasons I see a lot of Audubon faces on here. One of the reasons that we decided to really just partner so much with our EPC partners, aside from just sharing a lot of values with our friends, is that this is a year where there's going to be some very serious attacks on the Climate Commitment Act. The Climate Commitment Act, for those of you that remember, passed a few years ago, and it's the first time our state has had a price on carbon pollution. That policy is now playing out. We've collected a lot of revenue for the state from polluters, and now that money is going towards really important things. It's going towards it's funny stuff happening in the chat here. It's going towards really funny thing or really amazing things like EVs and charging and community solar and building retrofits to create more efficiency, hopefully electric school buses soon. So we wanted to really defend the Climate Commitment Act from the attacks that it's seeing from the fossil fuel industry and from kind of the right-wing business lobby. So the two policies that Leah was talking about are really a way of demonstrating that the Climate Commitment Act is not the reason that we're facing high gas prices. Even if it does contribute, it's actually profits from oil companies that is really driving that, and other kind of geopolitical things. And that we have such an opportunity to make huge investments in things that matter not just to the climate, like reducing emissions from diesel school buses, but actually protecting our most vulnerable humans here in Washington from the impacts of fossil fuels. So it's a really great opportunity for all of us to kind of come together around these priorities, and also pass a bill that is long overdue, which is the RAP Act. So this will be another hybrid session. I just want to note that this will be another hybrid session. So there will be opportunities that will be reaching out. WCA and Climate Solutions and Audubon will be reaching out about opportunities to testify remotely. Lobbyists will be in person. And then there's often going to be opportunities, TBD, we'll let you know about opportunities for other people to kind of show up at the Capitol and demonstrate their support for these policies. So at this point, we're going to get a little bit more into the details of what our advocacy days are going to look like. So I'm going to pass it over to Tara from 350 Washington.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. My name is Tara. I use she, her pronouns. And as Adam mentioned, I'm with 350 Washington. And I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight. This has just been such a great turnout and really, really awesome to see so many cool faces. So I'm here to talk about advocacy and lobbying. So what is the difference between advocacy and lobbying? I like to think of it as all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. So advocacy at its heart is educating others. And in this case, it's educating our government officials about pressing issues, or in our matter, the environmental priorities that Adam and Pam and Leah have mentioned earlier. So advocacy is really talking about that personal tie, really getting to the heart of why it's important to be there to educate and bring awareness to the certain topic of discussion. And lobbying is really a firm ask from the government official. So I do want to make that kind of clear that it's more so an ask. Sometimes you'll get a yes in support of what you're lobbying for. Sometimes you'll get a no, and more often than not, you're gonna get an unsure kind of response. So those are the two big things. And so for the advocacy days that we have coming up, as Adam mentioned, it is incredibly crucial that we are taking advantage of this time to build these relationships with our state senators and our state representatives. Have them know that their constituents are showing up and are using their voice to support really, really key issues. And kind of we're getting geared up for the lobbying that will happen once the legislature starts, or the session starts. So we can go to the next slide. So when does lobbying take place, and when does advocacy take place? So advocacy takes place, I like to say that it's perennial it's all year round. There is no end to advocacy. You can always voice your support for the RAP Act year long. Lobbying is annual. There's a season to it, and that season is during the session. So that session, as mentioned, is short. It's from January 7th or January 8th to March 7th, around that time. So it is really crucial, again, that we get those advocacy efforts started early, and really voice our support so that we have a strong foundation when we get into the start of the season or session. Sorry, I'm getting over COVID, so my brain's a little wobbly. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about virtual lobbying for the environment. It's the only kind of lobbying I'm really familiar with, but I would love to do some in-person lobbying soon. So doing your research, it is important to understand the issues that we're talking about, that we're advocating for, and reflect on how the support or the lack thereof on these issues would directly impact you or your family or your community. As I mentioned earlier, we're discussing our personal support and educating our representatives and senators. We are not going in there and demanding them for that support. That support is hopefully going to come with time after we give them and present them with the information and personal relationship we have to these environmental priorities. It is important to note that this information, you don't have to go too in depth on every single issue. You do not have to be super unbelievably genius to do this work, to be an advocate for the environment, to lobby for the environment. So I don't want to put pressure that you have to know every single priority or issue that's happening. Just one that speaks to you and one that you can connect with. That's really going to help your legislator also understand your storytelling while you're advocating. So you can think of personal experiences or instances how the issue affected you, as I mentioned. And then learning about the legislator and their aid. Yes, very important to understand what the legislator that you're speaking to has voiced their support in before. Did they support something that you were really excited about? Did they veto, or did they not support something that you were really passionate about? Really make sure that you're recognizing that they are doing work and they are trying, because they are humans just like us. It is really great to, again, be doing these advocacy days because you get to build a relationship with the aide. And during session, a lot of the time, you're going to be meeting with the aide. It's really rare to be meeting with the legislator themselves. So developing that relationship with the aide is super crucial. I'm not saying you have to know their whole background and what's important to them, but it is a super big part of the work that we're doing. And with that, let's hop to the next slide. So how do we get this work going? How do we start? We start lobbying by building a team. Right now, that's what we're working on. Some of you on this call may have already received emails about upcoming meetings during advocacy days. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build that constituent power. We're trying to bring your voices to the table, and you can feel free to reach out to others in your community and see if they'd like to connect and be involved in the work that we're doing. And so what does that team look like? We can hop to the next slide, and I will try and wrap up as fast as possible. My apologies. So the timing of each role is dependent on the length of the meeting. The meetings that we're looking at are anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. So the timekeeper is going to be on top of how long certain people are talking for, and all of those roles that are listed here will be allocated or doled out during the prep for these meetings that we have with the legislators. So we'll have the person who's going to be doing, facilitating the introductions, making sure that you know, hey, we're moving from this topic to this topic to this topic. Have someone that's appreciating the work that the legislator has done, have someone that's writing a thank you note, have someone that's taking notes. So all that's figured out before the meeting itself takes place, and we're going to have office hours to prep the timing of all of these roles for their respective meetings. Next slide, please. So before the actual meeting, you also have to determine what your goals and strategies are. You are their constituent. What you say matters. Why is this important to you? How can you connect with the lawmaker that you're meeting with? How would you want to engage with someone you're trying to connect with? So what do you think would be the most effective way to engage with them? Again, they're human beings. They are trying to do work. They're trying just like everybody else. So making sure that we engage with kindness and patience, not blaming, really just going in there with the opportunity to engage and help someone learn more about a really important environmental issue. So we're really just there to educate, advocate for the environmental priorities. And again, we might not get a definitive yes or no answer on support of these priorities. And there will be opportunities to lobby when session begins. So after that, the goals and strategies are determined, you make an agenda, you have an introduction. Again, you have someone that thanks the legislator for their previous work. You have someone that shares a personal story. You maybe have 1 or 2 people share a personal story, again, dependent on the amount of time that you have during this meeting. And the ask for commitment of supporting happens during lobbying. The agenda for the advocacy days would be a little bit different because again, we're educating. So this could be kind of pulling information. So it could be a topic of like electrification and how, you know, saying supporting more laws for electrifying our state would greatly impact you and your community. And then, for example, during a lobbying meeting, you would specifically talk about the laws that are introduced during session and could get more in depth with the messaging and your asks, aka, you know, supporting 100% electric or clean school buses. And then, of course, make room for questions if you have time to get a little bit more engaged, get a little bit more familiar with one another. And then afterwards, you would have a little debrief meeting. Someone would send the thank you note, and you thank them for their time and follow up with any other additional information about the environmental priorities that we're advocating for the upcoming session. So once the agenda is made, we can hop to the next slide. You're in the meeting. I'm not going to read off everything that's on this slide, but I will just make note of the key points. Be a really active listener and don't be afraid to interject. This is a conversation. You don't have to be an expert in these issues. You just have to be a constituent, which, by the way, everybody here on this call is a constituent. Congratulations. Confidence is key. It is nerve-wracking, but man, is it super fun to utilize your voice in a really cool way. Be direct and concise, and that is why we have the prep sessions. Sometimes I am not direct and concise, and I love preparing in advance for these advocacy meetings. And remain focused, remain on message. We have one shot to really make an impression so that we can hopefully get meetings and get support come January, February, and March of next year. And we can hop to the next slide, please. Be prepared. It's quite obvious. Then we're gonna prep during the prep meetings that we have, or the office hours, which are November 29th and November 30th, as mentioned on this slide here. And I will just quickly move along to the next slide so that I can pass it over to Joelle. And then, as I mentioned earlier, after the meeting, you will have a debrief session if possible. It is not always necessary, but it is nice to just see how it went with everybody, answer any burning questions that are firing right then and there, and get everybody ready for the next steps, sending the thank you note, following up with answers to any questions that they may have had, and staying in contact to keep that relationship keep that relationship secure. So whew, I went over my time by a little bit. Apologies, but I'm going to pass it off to Joelle to discuss the next steps. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Tara. Great job. Yeah, well, Tara went through a lot of it. Just to reiterate that you will get a follow-up email from one of us with the recording of tonight's training and also the slides. And Tara and Adam are reaching out to all of you to, number one, find the times for your constituent meetings based on what the office of that legislator is saying will work. And they're reaching out to you to see which time collectively works the best for you to join together in a practice session, either on the 29th or the 30th. So they are being amazing liaisons for us in this sense. And then during those practice sessions, or office hours, we're also calling them, you'll be put into breakout rooms, so you can actually join in. Like I'm in the 42nd, so I'll join the other folks in the 42nd district, and then we'll, discuss the roles and the different things that we're planning on covering, each one of us. And then that will also be a chance for more questions to be answered by the organizers here. And then Advocacy Days happen December 4th through the 8th. And we will upload this video onto the Lobby Days website that Kat will drop in. It'll also be in the follow-up email. And that's a hub for one-pagers. Some are ready now, some will be ready by the 4th, and other resources coming. And if you want to go to the next slide, we've got points of contact. Myself and Wes Stewart, who's not able to be here tonight because they have another training with Sierra Club folks, but they're helping a lot with this effort, so you can reach out to either one of us. And then holding oil companies accountable, our Kat Holmes and myself will help answer questions there. And you heard from Pam Cloth on the RAP Act, and then General Advocacy Day questions. Adam has graciously agreed to do that. Before we do the final thank you, are there more questions? Can't see everyone here yet. Or Adam or Kat or Tara, Pam, did I miss anything?
No, Joelle, it was perfect. I'll just say, so one of the challenges is scheduling these meetings with legislators. They often have busy schedules, and the representatives in the House, they actually have committee days at the beginning of this week, which means they'll be down in Olympia, busy with meetings. But Tara and I are working to get as many meetings scheduled as possible. And those of you who've signed up and are in a specific district, we will be reaching out to you once those meetings are scheduled. So you may not have heard from Tara or I yet, but as soon as we get one of those meetings scheduled, you will. And then we'll connect you with fellow constituents to come to one of those 2 practice sessions at the end of the month on November 29th and November 30th. So Joelle, you said that, and I think it was clear. I just wanted to emphasize Tara and I's role in helping to schedule these meetings, connect you with your fellow constituents, and get you prepared.
Thank you so much, Adam. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of all the organizers that helped put this together tonight. We are so grateful for you taking time out of your busy lives to be here, to come to these important meetings, which from my experience of many years of doing this work, it is the number one thing, the number one most important thing that I think we can do as community members, as activists, to meet with them in person and make that connection. And I also want to say, as a relatively new mom, my little guy's over there watching a show. I am so grateful for everything you are doing right now and everything you've done in the past to help create positive change. Like, it really, really does make a difference in our own lives, and especially the little ones coming up. And I am just in deep gratitude to all of you. So I want to say thank you, thank you. Justin, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious, for the meetings, is the goal to cover all 3 topics in one meeting, or will there be like multiple meetings with each legislature?
Just the one meeting. So like I'm in the 42nd, so then I'll meet with Senator Shoemake, and between our team, we'll just decide, who has more passion for school buses, and one person can mention oil accountability and one person can cover RAP Act, based on, where the affinity is. But we definitely are going to try to cover all 3 of the environmental priorities, even though briefly, especially if we're given a very short amount of time. And again, we can go through that a little more in the practice session, so everyone feels comfortable about their role and knowing how much time is allotted for that number of folks. Alpana, I think you're on mute.
There are some bills that you have to talk to the senators, let's say it's been introduced there. And there are some bills that are been introduced by the reps. So if you want to talk about the certain bills like RAP Act, then you have to talk to that representative or senator. And if you have to talk about the school bus, so if you want to talk both, then you have to be with both the senators and representative. How that is possible?
Adam, do you want to talk a little more about the scheduling?
Are they going to be in the same room, or they're going to be in a different room?
Well, so that depends on the legislator's preference. The way we're setting up the outreach to the legislators, it's likely that the meetings will be separate. Although I've already heard from a couple districts where they're trying to combine so that the reps would be in the same, at least the reps would be in the same meeting. And last year, actually, it was the case that representatives and senators wanted to be in the same meeting. So I'm not sure if that completely addresses your question.
Yeah, that's okay. I get it. Last year I was there, and senator was not possible to. She wasn't able to attend. But 2 of them were there. Yeah. So.
And I think, our hope is that they will go through both chambers, right? So even if they're not the first chamber, if the reps don't get it first, then hopefully they'll get it second, and vice versa. So the hope is that we're talking to everyone, because everyone's going to touch that bill at some point.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm doing this from last 5 years.
Thank you. I recognize you. Thank you so much.
I'm doing the federal level, mostly, but at this time I do it, the local ones too. Yeah.
And Rosemary?
Thank you so much.
I was wondering why you're doing it, the interviews remotely. I mean, it seems like there's something lost there as compared to how it would be if you were in person.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is a statewide advocacy days, and so it's just an opportunity for people who are further flung from Olympia to be able to participate. I think I agree, just in general in life and in terms of like lobbying, it's just in person is better. You just get so much more out of in-person interactions. But we're trying to make sure that we can include people from east side of the mountains to Vancouver, and just get as many people in front of legislators as possible.
And when they have town halls, we will definitely also be reaching out to folks to chime in that way. Of those will probably be virtual as well. But as we get closer, if some of the key legislators, you know, we could possibly reach out and say, if you could do an in-person meeting with them, if they would take it, that would be amazing. Or maybe we could facilitate that. We don't know all of the priority legislators yet on at least the school buses and oil accountability, but absolutely. I think Adam is just also, as he mentioned, just the short session, that we're trying to just do so much really quickly, so that we're ready to go during session, and they have, you know, we're kind of doing the best we could with a short amount of time. But I agree, in general, in person's best. Pam, did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to add and Kat addressed it in the chat, but I know some of the advocates will be organizing some in-person opportunities during session as well. So definitely look out for those, and we would love participation in that. I know that the Plastics Coalition on the RAP Act are thinking about Martin Luther King Day as an in-person opportunity.
Yeah, one of the things that we as kind of a coalition of organizers talked about with this short session is that if we could do a lot of training now in November, in early December, we could get a lot of folks trained up or create the resources so that once legislative session has started, people already have a sense of how to do the lobbying, and that we can focus more on supporting getting folks that are able to make it to some of these key lobby days. And also, like Joelle said, we really want to try and support people on that town hall turnout, because that's in your own backyard. So that'll be another thing that we can support on, because we're doing these sessions earlier. I also, while I've got the mic, for those folks who don't mind coming, turning on their cameras, I'd love to do a quick photo and just get a quick picture of all the wonderful folks who gathered on a Thursday evening in November, because you care about nature and birds and community and people. Fabulous. Okay. I'm going to do a countdown. I'll do a 3, 2, 1. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay, let me check, make sure it worked. All right, fabulous. Okay. Any other questions?
You have the last word, Kat.
Okay, well, I look forward to seeing you all during those practice sessions. I'm really excited to have folks connecting with their legislators early in December, starting those relationships. And this will not be the last time you hear from us. It's really just the first time, because we're going to have a really great, we're going to take advantage of those 60 days, and we're going to make the most of the opportunities and the challenges that we're going to face in 2024 legislative session. So thank you all for being here. Anything else, team?
Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah.
Right. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Hey, all.